Welcome to Charter Local Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance in Los Angeles County today, and we are joined by the Registrar Recorder of that county. His name is Dean Logan. I want to speak with you about voter registration. I remember back in the 90s, there was a big push, specifically by MTV, if you remember, for what was known as Motor Voter. It was the first time the DMV got involved in voter registration. Take us back to that time.
Right, so that was a movement, and you're exactly right, late 80s, early 90s, that ended up with the passage of the National Voter Registration Act, which enacted a number of different voter registration reforms, in particular kind of federalized that to a certain extent, where there's a federal form where you can register anywhere in the country. Motor voter was a big piece of that. That was something pioneered in Oregon and Washington, where people would be asked to register to vote at the time that they got their driver's license. There's also an agency-based registration process. So if you're accessing public social services, if you're at a military recruitment center or something like that, the idea was that when we have people in those public facilities captive and they meet the requirements to be a registered voter, to go ahead and streamline that application process and get them on the rolls.
And did Motor Voter, did that federal legislation increase registration? Did we see that?
It did, and it did at various levels around the country. Some places had great success with it. Others early on had great success with it, and then it sort of leveled out, which is to be expected. I think a lot of it had to do with getting the DMV agencies to take on this additional responsibility. I think there was sort of this sense of, this isn't our core function, but it is legally mandated. So there was a lot of work in terms of just getting, the people who work there on a day-to-day basis to recognize, no, that's a requirement. You need to have that interaction with everybody who's at your counter.
So we fast forward to this decade, and California is taking a very significant step in its efforts to register voters vis-a-vis through the DMV.
Right.
It's known as the legislation is AB 1461. Explain to us how the DMV will now play a pivotal role in the registration of Californians.
Yeah, I think this is groundbreaking legislation. It's referred to as the New Motor Voter Act, sometimes referred to as the Automatic Voter Registration Act, which is a little bit of an overstatement. But this does two things, or kind of two broad things. One, it recognizes that the way we've been doing motor voter for the past decade is outdated. We still rely on paper forms that people are filling out at that DMV counter that come back through the state, through the Secretary of State to my office. They get entered into the database. So this automates that. And it says that, wow, you're getting all that information already on the driver's license application, so let's just transfer that data over to the Registrar of Voters.
But it's more than just transferring
it. Is.
Explain what it is.
So the big difference here, the most significant difference, is this fundamentally changes us from an opt-in system of voter registration to an opt-out system of voter registration. So when this takes effect, and there's still some work to be done before it goes into effect, but when it goes into effect, every person who interacts with DMV to renew a driver's license, to get a new driver's license, a new state ID card, if the data that's in the file for DMV meets the requirements for them to be a registered voter, they will automatically become a registered voter. They'll be prompted to identify a party selection and whether or not they want to be a vote-by-mail voter, and then they'll have 30 days to opt out of being a registered voter as opposed to affirmatively opting into being a registered voter.
This is stunning. It
really is stunning, but if you think about it in this day and age, with all the data that's available, the data's out there, and voter registration is a fundamental right. And how many of our rights do we have to opt into?
Let me ask you, have other states adopted this approach?
Oregon, again, took the lead on this. Oregon is up and running on it.
How long have they been up and running?
I think just under a year.
Okay.
So I think they passed it one legislative session ahead of California. There's slightly different. In Oregon, they actually are going back through the existing DMV files and bringing those people onto the voter file. We're not going to do that here.
Do we have a sense as to whether the Oregon model has created a spike in actual voting? It's one thing to be registered. Yeah. It's another thing to have voted.
No, I think that's an important point, and I think it's too early to know in Oregon because they haven't had a statewide election. The presidential will be the bellwether of that. Of course, turnout's always high in a presidential, so it'll probably be a couple of cycles before we see that. That's one of the arguments about this, is that it's it's billed as something to address the turnout crises that we have, or the participation crises that we have. But by raising the number of registered voters, that turnout it is going to skew things for a while. But I think fundamentally, what's important here is it's going to enable us to, over time, shift resources. The amount of time, money, and staff that we spend on this outdated manual voter registration process, those resources are going to be able to be shifted now towards voter education and outreach.
In some ways, we won't see the folks at the malls asking us to register to vote. I mean, there's just no need.
Right.
There's no need. I guess, though, not everyone drives technically.
Right.
So,
and you know, there's always this thing of if you move, who do you notify first? Do you update your registration?
If you just are getting an ID card from the DMV, will that
same applies?
Okay.
Same applies. As long as the data meets the requirements.
Now, there's always a question about those that are not eligible to vote. It could be they're not citizens. We know, not connected to AB 1461, a bill passed a few years ago known as AB 60, and that allowed undocumented folks to receive a driver's license. So if someone receives an AB 60 driver's license, what happens vis-a-vis registration, voter registration?
Yeah, I think that's really the beauty of this system is that DMV has that data, so they know that person is a non-citizen. So that's not going to transfer over on the file. I think the bigger challenge is going to be making sure that when people who are on the AB 60 file go through the process of becoming citizens, how do we make sure that they still are able to engage and that we don't keep them from becoming registered
Am I
voters?
correct? If one's a convicted felon, voting rights are limited. Is that accurate?
If you're in custody serving time for a felon, then you do lose your voting rights during that time period. But
if you're released from jail and you have the felony conviction, you can vote.
As long as you are not on supervised probation. Correct.
So is there a way for the DMV and therefore the Registrar of Voters to figure out whether those folks would be eligible? Is that tricky?
Yes. Well, I think those are, in some ways, those are two separate things. But again, in this world of data sharing, we should be much better at matching those things. DMV is not going to keep track of people who are incarcerated or whether it's a felon or misdemeanor. We get those notifications from the court system. I think that the challenge is making sure that when people are released and they now have their right to vote available again, getting them back on the system.
So they
I do think right now they would have to reapply. They'd have to fill out a form or again go in through DMV. I think that'll change over time.
Do we anticipate this new piece of legislation to create more voters will be in effect by the 2016 presidential election, either primary or general?
Yeah, no, it will not be in effect for the 2016 election. I think probably the earliest will be in 2017. There are a number of steps required in the law that have to be met. We have to finish a statewide voter registration database.
Which means?
It's the mechanism that changes it from 58 different county databases of registered voters to where you have one record as a registered voter in California.
Really?
So when you move, you don't have to re-register anymore. Your registration will follow you as long as you're in the state of California. That will be complete in June of 16. In fact, LA County just went live on the system now. They're rolling it out right now. So that's the first threshold. There's some funding issues that the legislature has to address going forward. The Secretary of State has to adopt some regulations. Once those three things are done, then technically the DMV has 1 year to do implementation, although that could be accelerated.
His name is Dean Logan. He is the Registrar Recorder for the County of Los Angeles. My name is Brad Pomerance. We thank you so much for joining us on Charter Local Edition.